And thank you. Yes, there is this part of the presentation will actually be recorded. So what my thinking is that I'm going to take you through a particular presentation, and I think right after that we're going to have just a very short break. And after that break, we'll come back and we'll do a discussion, and we'll and in this discussion, what I would really like to do is hear from you some of your questions, the questions that came up when you may have read the article, the questions that come up just as I talk through some of what our learning has been over time, and what our learning continues to look like, how it continues to evolve. Learning is such an incredible, it's such an incredible thing because it doesn't stop, and how we integrate uh, sometimes what might seem like the same information one day um, to the next day can look quite different, simply because of the space that we're in, or the new experiences that we've had. So I'm going to take you through just our learning around the community journey of change through the relational determinants of health. And as you can see here, I've put myself on here on the title, but I've also put Dr. Deborah Pepler, and I've put Deb because I really want to acknowledge that it was Deb and I together that led so much of our learning that I'm sharing with you today. So I don't want to make it seem that I'm just sharing learning that I have learned. That really there was many others that have been on this learning journey, and me and Deb were the two that wrote about this particular learning journey. So, and I just in the next slide, where I'm just acknowledging that I'm, coming to you from Lekwungen territory, I also wanted to acknowledge that that Deb lives in the traditional territory of Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, also known as Toronto. And I really want to also acknowledge the many territories that you're joining from today. And regardless of where you are joining from today, you're joining from sacred land. This, for me, one of my learnings that continues to just grow is our connection to the land, and the greater our connection to the land, the greater we see the gifts that are around us with the land. In the next slide, I wanted to actually start right away by defining one of the and I guess our main question that we were really starting to explore when we started this relationship. So I'll give a little bit of background here. When I introduced myself, one of the things that I talked about was that I came into the Canadian Red Cross as somebody that was really focusing on violence prevention and protection strategies within communities. For me, one of the things that I saw as being a real gap space in community was understanding this harm that seemed to be impacting all of our lives. Now, for me, I come from a really large family. My father, Musquis, from northern Alberta, he has 18 brothers and one sister who, from a young age, we always said, "Poor Aunt Doris," and I remain saying that. But he comes from this large family, and 17 of them were deeply impacted by residential school. And it's a real shared history for many of us as Indigenous peoples. It's one of those things that we really share, is that in our lives, there has been an incredible amount of harm, and most of that harm is not talked about. Most of that harm is silenced, and most of that harm doesn't have a place for us to go to better understand, sometimes understand ourselves. And that's a real challenge. And for me, when I started to learn about aspects of harm, especially aspects of historical harm, I think that I was on this journey of being shocked, of being continually shocked. You know, it's interesting in that I come from a family where communication is huge. And I feel really blessed about that. The first time I heard about residential school, I was 5 years old. And I remember sitting at the table and we were having supper. And my dad started to share a story about a kind of about that related to what we were having for supper that night. And he started to share this story of being forced to eat some bad food. That and our supper that night, not that it was bad food, in fact it was good food that we were eating, but what he had had is he had had something like that, but it was rotten, you know. And so for me as this young child, I couldn't quite understand why somebody would have made him eat something like that when he was a child. And it started a curiosity for me. And it was allowed to be a curiosity as opposed to a shock, because there was a gentle communication in how that information was shared. So he shared information in this gentle way. And it allowed me, even though I understood it wasn't okay, it allowed me a curiosity. And what I have found in my life is that that curiosity feeds me, and that curiosity continues to grow. And that curiosity brought me into the work of better understanding violence and better understanding how we can prevent violence, how we can prevent this ongoing harm that I think we've come to accept as normal far too often in our lives. And so it was really interesting when I started my friendship with Deborah Pepler. We, you know, it was interesting in that we shared and shared and shared much of the work that we were doing. And we grew to start having questions around the work that we were doing. And one of the questions for me that was really big is I wanted to understand how to best contribute towards community change, because that was the big question that community after community, as I would facilitate content and information around violence, what violence is, how we can understand it, how we can talk about it. What communities often would ask me is, how do we change? What are the processes we need within community that will actually help to shift and help to change the space that we are, and what we've come to understand as, I think, just normal behaviors, but we don't want them to be normal behaviors anymore. And for me, that was really what prompted this research question. It prompted our thinking around what aspects of community process are working when it comes to change, and what aspects might not be working. And that's really where this paper that we wrote grew from, and that's really where I want to delve into today. And so, if we look at the next slide, one of the things that we realized very early on is we realized in this bigger research project that that we took on, that we needed to best not just understand, but come to agreement around what our foundational values were going to look like. And that's a real important thing. And it's important because you need to understand the foundation that you're standing on. And you need to understand why it is that particular foundation. Just like Lionel talked about in that beautiful prayer and in the stories of the prophecies and such, all of that deepens your foundational knowledge. All of that deepens that. And so for us, we knew that we wanted to work from a place of respect. We knew that. And we also knew that we wanted to work together in a decolonizing way. And when we said that, what we really meant by that is that as we would talk about aspects of harm, we wanted to name them as such. As we talked about wellness, we wanted to name it as such. For us, it was about really, unpacking the things that we were learning about and giving language as we were unpacking it, and not trying to cover up difficult things with pretty language, but really unpacking things in a way that spoke to really, naming harm where harm takes over, but giving space for healing and wellness language that needs more space. We wanted to have open communication. We wanted to ensure that learning happens in all places, and we wanted to really understand our responsibility through the learning process and our accountability, because we were learning with and together in many different communities. And so and so that for us was really important. One of the things that we came to learn very, very quickly, it was really interesting. If you just go to the next slide, Wendy, um, one of our very first big learnings happened very early as we started to work with communities. Um, we we knew that there has been a great deal of work that's happened around understanding how to do research together with communities, especially with Indigenous communities. We knew that there has been thoughtful work that has happened from communities, from Indigenous scholars, from non-Indigenous scholars, and working with Indigenous communities. We learned that there is this, incredible conversation that is about how do we protect uh, cultural knowledge? How do we protect and recognize knowledge holders? How do we ensure that Indigenous knowledge is Indigenous owned? How do we ensure that rightful place to information stays with people and that they own their information and such? And what was really interesting is that as we started to create partnerships, we created partnerships with communities that we had already done a great deal of work with. And so, but the work that we had been doing with communities was work that we were there because of the programs, of the violence prevention programs that we were facilitating and teaching and building capacity around within communities. We hadn't originally been there because we were doing research around these. And so one of our learnings very quickly is that when we start talking about research protection frameworks, this was something that really was much more understood within the academic world than it was in the program world, and definitely in the community world. And in the community world, there was actually very little understanding of research protection frameworks. And so what we did find is that in the beginning of the process of working together with community, we spent a big chunk of time around educating around protection frameworks. And that was because one of our foundational values was being accountable to community. It was one of our foundational values. And if community doesn't understand how a researcher or even a program developer is accountable to them, then there is no accountability. Accountability only is true if the community understands how to be, how you need to be accountable to them. And so for us, that was, I think, our first big learning in the process, is that within communities, the whole area of protection frameworks when it comes to research is not well enough known. Now, I just wanted to highlight just who our community partners were when we started to do this work, because we, like I said, we worked with communities some that we've had very long-standing relationship with, and some that we've had relationships with, but in other ways, not necessarily working in the area of violence prevention. We wanted to work with an urban Indigenous community, and so we worked with the Victoria Native Friendship Center. We wanted to work with Inuit hamlets, and we were deeply involved with Arviat and with Cape Dorset. So those were the two communities that agreed and wanted to work with us around this. And then we also have worked quite extensively with Black Lake First Nation as well as with Moosonee. So those are the two communities, the two First Nations. And we really wanted there to be understanding from an urban community as well as understanding from Inuit and First Nations, because we recognized really strongly that when we use that word Indigenous as this overall word, it has 1,000 different meanings. And so we thought, let's explore the First Nations meaning, the Inuit meaning, and the urban meaning, in order for us to better to better learn about this. So I thought what I would do is I would talk a little bit about what we've learned so far about violence prevention and what we've learned about pathways to wellness. When we started this work, we had a very specific project framework. And in that project framework, we knew that we wanted to, if you could just move the slide, we knew that we wanted to understand the cycle of violence, and we knew that we already did understand the cycle of violence. And so we filled in this particular circle so that we could actually, we really thought through what would actually go into these places when we start talking about the cycle of violence. And then from there, we thought what we are working towards is we're working towards contributing to wellness or contributing to healing. And so what we did is we then also filled that in. We filled in our ideas, our teachings, our understandings of what would contribute to healing and healing practice and healing process. And what we knew is that our question was situated between these two circles. And so that little green dot that kind of shows this canoe that's moving in a very intentional way towards healing. What we wanted to understand best is, how do we move from this circle to a place of wellness? How do we move away from that in the best possible way? What was really interesting is that very early into our research, we developed questions that we would ask within community. And those questions really focused on these two circles. So they focused on better understanding harm and better understanding wellness. They focused on those two areas. And that was, I think, for us, one of the places where we really got a bit of a shock. very early on, we started to work with research advisories in all of the communities that we were in. And one of the things that became unanimous in all of the communities is that they didn't want to answer the questions around the harm. They wanted to focus on answering the questions around the healing. And so for us to be responsible, to be accountable to this process, we said, okay, let's just have questions around the circle of healing. Let's focus our questions there. But what we still need to better understand is we still need to better understand the cycle of violence, because it is the cycle of violence that is holding us often in places we don't want to be. That's what's happening. And so for us, we realized we needed to figure out a different way of actually exploring the cycle of harm, the cycle of violence. And so one of the things that we really realized is that in today's world, there has been thousands of Indigenous people, very brave, just with a great deal of courage, that have written about aspects of the cycle of violence and have done extensive writing through articles, through books, uh, in various for various conferences, in dissertations. And so we thought, why don't we look to the literature and look to the literature to actually start to explore the cycle of violence? And if we just look to the literature, what could we actually learn from that? And I think for us, right away, we were actually really quite blown away at, first off, the amount of literature there is that actually helps us to better understand historical harm, but also the profound stories that are really, that so many people have shared around aspects of their life, around their story, not just of harm, but their journey, their overall journey from a place of often disparity to really a place of groundedness, and what that looked like and what that entailed, and the story that they needed to better understand. One of the things that we really realized very quickly as well is that when we talk about harm within community, that very often, um, if we're in a non-Indigenous content, or if we're with non-Indigenous people, many times the conversation goes to the place of residential schools. It often goes to that place. And it's because that, I think, in Canada is something that is the most understood. It's the most talked about, and it's the most reported on. But really, once you start going to the literature to better understand historical harm, there's a much bigger story that actually arises, and that really comes into a place of clarity. And so for us, one of the things that we realized is that we needed to really stay in the literature for a period of time in order to really unpack what is really known about historical harm, but needs the pieces to come together. So when you look at the next slide, and I'll just show it, the next slide just briefly, is we ended up getting into a literature review. And I don't expect you to actually read what's on this page right here, because I realize that there's a great deal that is on here. But what this literature review told us is it started to really go through the 14 different significant events that have happened on Turtle Island, and especially the northern part of Turtle Island, which is now called Canada. And the events that have happened here, often the very systematic events that have happened here, that have greatly contributed to the disparity that often many of us work in. Lots of our jobs is working with disparity. And where we can contribute in really good ways when we're working with disparity is the better we understand that disparity, the greater it is that we can contribute to depowering it. And so one of the things that we did is if you look at the next slide, and again another slide that you really cannot read, is we started to then go through all of the different things that the literature was telling us. If you when I look across the very top row, that's a bit of a darker blue. What that is that shows time frames, and so that shows from 1500 to 1550. That shows from 1550 to 16, and it kind of shows across the board. And it was okay to, Wendy, when you change that, because really, in essence, what that particular graph has started to teach us is it started to teach us this layering effect that is continuously increasing and is leading to this history of harm. And it's by understanding what is all within that history of harm that we're better able to understand how it is contributing to disruptions within communities and how it's contributing to disruptions within people's lives. Because often that's where we come in, in that space of disruption. And so what we needed to understand is what's creating the disruption. Often the disruption that we look at, that we want to better understand, when we work in the area of violence prevention, we're often working in that area of either child abuse, we're working in the area of relationship violence, we're working in the area of bullying, we're working in some aspect of disparity for a person or for a community. And so for us, one of the things that the history of harm has helped us to better understand is it's helped us to understand that when there is a real adverse event that happens in people's lives, and so the example would be, it could be any of these, but I'll take residential school because that's again, that is often what we talk about. Residential schools happened at a time that there was already a great deal of disease, of substance use, of dislocation, of stolen land. It happened on top of a foundation where the abuse of power was extreme. And then we went into this space of residential schools. And then as residential schools started to close, we went into this space then of the justice system or the child welfare system taking over and starting to punish people for the disparity that they suffered through residential schools. And so here, it's interesting in that as we start to look at that history of harm, it helps us to understand that harm happens in this layered way. And in the absence of addressing any of the layers turn into this cascade. And that cascade can be looked at as a cascade of harm, a cascade of trauma, a cascade of violence. But if intervention doesn't happen in aspects of those lines that you see, what's going to overtake is it's going to overtake in this wave. And this is something that, like I said, we were able to put this together really very much because of how much is written in the literature that is to be put together. So what we learned then is we learned about the pathways of violence also across the lifespan. So we learned about when all of a sudden that cascade becomes a cascade in people's lives. There's a normalization that comes along with that. And in that normalization, what happens is that, when we look at child abuse, that can lead to dating aggression, to marital abuse, to child abuse, to elder abuse. When we look at relationship violence, when we look at bullying, that can lead to gang aggression, that can lead to, community violence. The stories of these things, the stories of the pathways to violence, are the stories that we worked really intimately with in the communities that we had partnered with. We knew that these were challenges, these were deep challenges within the community. But the other thing that we really came to understand is we came to understand that what really lacked within our original model is that there need to actually be greater clarity around what was in that model and really how we actually stated that. So we went back to our model and we said, let's go back to the model and let's refill in the model with what we've really all learned from community. And so in the cycle of violence, we actually took those 14 different areas that we had learned from the literature and we dispersed them into the quadrants that made the most sense for them to be in. And what that really helped us to do is that helped us then look at the circle of wellness. And within the circle of wellness, it helped us then to actually say, how is wellness, if we looked at wellness in an intentional way, in an intentional pathway, then if you start to look at harm, and these are the areas that arise, what would wellness from that harm look like? Now, realize that for communities, so for the communities that we worked with, the circle of wellness and what we've identified here within the circle of wellness is very much what we identified and talked about with the communities. This can look different for different communities. It doesn't necessarily need to be. When we start to really focus around wellness, this needs to really be for a community how they define it to be. What we put together is we put together what worked for the communities that we worked closely with. But it was really interesting because when we look back at that big Excel spreadsheet that we created, and the first layer of harm in that was contact. When Lionel shared that story about, his grandmother's teaching, and his grandmother said, if somebody comes to you to be in relation, but they come bearing a gun, take note. Take note. Are they bearing a gun or are they bearing their hand? Are they giving their hand? There's a big difference. And when we start to look at contact, one of the biggest challenges that we had from contact is that those that came were bearing guns, and those that came had an idea of their own superiority. And what happened is that created that initial foundation. Contact then, because contact between nations doesn't need to be a bad thing. If somebody comes into relation bearing their hand, it's a beautiful thing, and it can be a beautiful thing. But when that doesn't happen and there's an idea of superiority, it changes the foundation for moving forward. So when we start to look then at what, how initial contact contributed to harm, and then we compare that to how it could have looked, it could have looked a lot different if there was an interest in staying healthy with the land, in contributing in good ways to the relationship, and in really contributing in ways that were relational and created that space of wanting to be respectful of the relationship that who you were meeting had with the land and within their communities. And so When we started to look at any of those cycles within the cycle of violence, what we had to then look at is what is the opposite of that. So if you start to look at slavery and missing people, then when you start to look at what is different and what could be, if it was from a good place, it would be about working in connection and working with all my relations and working together with creator. If we wanted to start looking at residential school or the 60s scoop, but you looked at actually not that relationship, but the opposite, you're looking at building healthy, stable, and harmonious relationships. You're looking at how do we support during difficult experiences? How do we build resilience? So we kind of started to look at what is the opposite of these things. And it was really interesting because that's, to me, one of the significant places that community really helped us to work through is they said, how do we understand violence and how do we really want to live, which is very much the opposite. It's very different from that. So when we start to look at what we learned from communities and what communities were so clear with us around their journey, is that regardless of how we looked at this, the solutions had to include culture. We had to ensure that culture was present because culture is about wellness. We had to look at the importance of intergenerational involvement. You can go to the next slide, Wendy, because one of the things that was a real challenge for communities is communities often would say to us, when programs come into community, what often happens is that the program contributes to separation, in that the wellness of an individual isn't happening within the context of their family or community. They're actually just working on it by themselves. When we start to look at learning and bringing in education to classrooms, often it's the classroom that learns together as opposed to the child and their family and their community. And it was really interesting because one of the things that communities really started to talk about is that our learning environment is often set up. When we look at the Western way of a learning environment, it's set up in a way that separates people and that separates community members from each other, separates family members from each other. So what then happens is that in the learning environment, the space for elders' teachings often isn't brought into that. And so we forget that there has to be intergenerational involvement. So it was really interesting. That was really big for community. Another big thing for community is that we need to increase the understanding of root causes of violence. So when we look at that, when we look at our model and we look at the cycle of violence, we need to actually have more education so people have a space to go to understand the cycle of violence. They also need to understand the layers and how it works as a cycle, but also what layered harm looks like, because that helps us to understand the root causes and how root causes become normalized in people's lives. We always have to remember that when we're talking about different challenges, we need to also talk about the strengths and the strengths of culture and the strengths of community. It's really interesting. This was really big learning for us, is that, and it was really big learning, I think, for me, because I've done so much work in the area of violence prevention. But one thing that community was really clear about is they said, violence prevention work is it's critical work. It is important work, but it stops at the halfway point. Often what happens is that we talk about what causes violence. So we'll talk about history. We'll talk about how this has normalized violence. We'll talk about the stories that are present in our lives. And and we'll talk about those things, and then say, here's some prevention strategies. But they said what happens then is that people learn many things that would be good for them to not do, things to not do because those things are normalizing harm. But what happens is that we don't spend enough time looking at the circle of wellness and looking at all of those things that actually could start to fill our time with wellness initiatives, with wellness spaces, with culture, with language, with greater connection to land. We often don't spend a great deal of time there. So what happens is that for programs, it's really important that we understand what we are helping to better address for behaviors that we are hoping will be reduced in people. But at the same time, we need to talk just as much about things that we want to add to people's lives. And that's the space where we have to be in partnership, in really good partnership with community, in really good partnership with our elders, in really good partnership with our knowledge holders, where those stories are also a whole part of the learning for people. Because if the learning just focuses on what not to do, then what happens is that it creates this vacuum in people, and people don't know how to fill it in. If people haven't learned about the positive within their culture or their community or their family or that space where they live, then often there hasn't been those ideas that have been planted that they can build from, and there has to be the plant of that. And we also need to ensure that we have community-driven solutions, and so much of the community-driven solutions really start to focus on culture. It really brings us to culture. One of the things that is really good also, if you could look at the next slide, is that it's really important that as we start to look at processes of wellness, that we really integrate values into that process. And so not necessarily the values of the team that you're working with, but what is somebody's traditional values? The Anishinaabe have been so generous in sharing the 7 traditional teachings. And I've worked in many communities where they use the Anishinaabe 7 traditional teachings, even if they're not an Anishinaabe community. And so there's a lot of gratitude that they have been allowed to do that, which has been great. And so I think that the other thing is to remember, it's kind of like, what are the foundations? What are the foundational values that we are adding, and that we are suggesting, that we're maybe not directing people to, but maybe just helping them to add to their thinking, to their learning. So, and if you could just go to a couple slides down, because I don't think that we'll watch that, but people can take a look at the video later if they would like to. So for us, one of the things that we really explored strongly is we explored the canoe, and we really explored that space between the circle, the cycle of violence, and the circle of wellness, and what are the ways that we can contribute in the best possible way. And for us, there was, what we realized more and more as we started to work with communities is that we have to integrate ways that connect people back to culture. We have to integrate, and that can be done in so many different ways. Sometimes it's by the people that we bring in. Sometimes it is by reintegrating and helping people to thanks for letting me know that, Stacy. Helping people to understand sometimes where culture can be accessed. It's really interesting. In some communities that we work together with, a culture wasn't something as being a strength. And so it was really helpful when we talked about all of the good that exists and the strength and the foundational strength that it contributes when you learn about your culture, when you learn your language, when you learn who the elders and the knowledge holders are in your community. So sometimes it was that we became the conduit for for connecting people back in to something that we could see that would be a real strength in their life. But they were told so much that it was something that they needed to discard. It was something to be ashamed of. It was something to not consider. That what happened is that you have to contribute to bringing a person back to themselves if in order for that person's wellness to flow, in order for that person to really start to explore their strengths and the greatness of the place that they come from. Often they have to hear that externally because the messages that they've been given, that they reside in, and sometimes the tapes within their thinking are a huge part of what's keeping them down. And so what we found is that we really found that we if we could be a conduit in the right way for people, that was the best way we could paddle with them in that canoe. That was, for us, that was the best way. Now, I think that and then if I just take it, yes, just to two down, for us, the real strong considerations for engagement when we start to look at our work with community is, these are the things that we found to just be really important. Is that when we start to look at defining wellness, we can't define wellness for a community or an individual. But what we can do is we can help to contribute as they explore what wellness needs to look like for them, what cultural integration needs to look like for them, and how they can start doing even more and more programs within community that are culturally based programs. And all of that really contributes to their self-determination. We really learned that as much as we teach content around the layers of harm, we also need to focus on the layers of safety and start talking about mentorship, about education, about language, and start almost teaching about safety in that very same way that safety is a layered process. Coming back to a place of trust is a layered process. We have to include culture. Um, Even when you don't understand a community's culture, you have to support that, understanding that you might never fully understand a community's culture, but the stronger culture is within community. What we do know is that there is lesser occurrences of harm in the community. So culture's working, culture does work. And however we can contribute to community cohesion is going to be a huge contribution that we can make. So always really promoting the intergenerational space within community, always promoting the importance of family, the importance of connection, always promoting that, if asking people, what is your ability to connect to the land? Because when it's about going back and saying, what are the relationships we want to promote, understanding that those, like really, within community and wherever we are, the space that we are in, with our surroundings, it is all relationship. It's not just the people. It's everything. We're in relationship. So for us, those were the things that really that's what we learned from community. And that is very much, yeah, just highlights, the incredible things that community taught us, which was so much. It was so, so much.